There's something really interesting about presidential executive orders. They are not mentioned anywhere in the United States Constitution or in any federal law. However, every single president, with one exception, has issued at least one executive order during his term in office. The exception was William Henry Harrison, who died of pneumonia about 6 weeks after taking office, which made him too busy to issue any executive orders. How is it these things have come to exist then if they're not authorized or mentioned in the Constitution? We need a little background first. The U.S. Constitution establishes a representative republic as our form of government with 3 equal branches. At the time that was created, that was absolutely unique in the world. And the Founding Fathers didn't do it by accident. What they wanted was a system that had tension built into it. The 3 equal branches all have to cooperate in order to get anything done. The legislative branch, made up of the Congress, creates laws. The executive branch, the president and all the federal agencies, implement the laws. And the courts analyze the laws in order to determine whether they're constitutional and whether or not they've been implemented properly. The Founding Fathers were all very much children of the Age of Enlightenment. And the idea that permeated the Age of Enlightenment from about the middle 1600s to about the middle 1700s, give or take, was the idea of change. And so our Founding Fathers created a document that's very, very short for a national constitution and has ambiguity built into it because they knew that there was going to be change in the future. One of the first changes that happened hit within about 15 years of the Constitution being adopted, and that was the formation of political parties. The Founding Fathers were not members of political parties. They didn't even exist. In fact, most of the founders were opposed to the idea until they decided to join them very soon after the Republic was created. The creation of political parties made it possible that the legislative branch and the executive branch of the government would be controlled by different political parties. And sure enough, that's exactly what has happened in about 40% of American history. That means that it's very, very common for the president to, in effect, have to swallow laws that are passed by the Congress and implement them. That's why, almost from the first days of the Republic, the president seized on the idea of the presidential executive order. Now, we have to think, what is a presidential executive order? In one way, nearly any instruction or order of any kind that a president gives, turn on the lights, is an executive order. But our sense of the executive order, the numbered executive orders like we see today, is actually fairly recent. It dates back to 1902, when the State Department started numbering executive orders and then worked backwards to number them to starting at about the beginning of the Lincoln presidency, give or take a little bit. Executive orders have been used for all kinds of things. The declared Thanksgiving a holiday, for example, was an executive order. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was actually an executive order. It was never passed by Congress. In fact, it would not have been passed by Congress if it had been introduced. On the other side of the coin, President Franklin Roosevelt's order to have the Japanese Americans interned at the start of World War II was also an executive order because he didn't believe he could get it through the Congress. One of the primary uses of executive orders is for presidents to be able to do things that they don't think they can get through the legislative process. Now that raises the question of whether or not these things are legitimate. After all, the legislative branch is supposed to be the branch that creates laws. Generally speaking, presidents dating from about Woodrow Wilson on have been very careful to issue executive orders which expanded or enhanced existing laws, but did not create a new law or alter a basic right. Now this is the problem, for example, that Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had. It did two things. It deprived people of their property. At that time, blacks were property in big parts of the United States. And it also created a system of freeing the slaves that did not exist. Now, at the time Lincoln did it, it was considered a strategic move, and that's why he did it, by the way, was to create chaos in the southern states, not to free the slaves. Did you know, by the way, that the Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the southern states? It did not free them in slave states that had not seceded from the Union. No, that wasn't Lincoln's intent. He wasn't interested in doing that. Now, as you can see, that executive orders have become a big deal. There are lots and lots of them issued. The all-time world record holder is President Franklin Roosevelt, who issued 3,800 of them during his 14 years in office. The all-time low record holder, other than the late William Henry Harrison, was President John Adams, who issued exactly one executive order during his 4 years in office. In modern times, executive orders have been much more common among wartime presidents, and that's why Roosevelt, Truman, Wilson, Lincoln, like that, hold the record for the majority of executive orders. In the last 50 years, when we've not had declared wars, other than one war was created by an executive order, and that was Bill Clinton's war in Bosnia, although later there was a congressional resolution that backed that. But other than the wartime presidents, the typical president has issued 44 executive orders per year during his term in office. Now, we hear a lot of talk about how President Obama has become an imperial president and dictatorial and issuing all these executive orders. He's actually below the curve. He's issued 37 of them per year so far. That's exactly the same that George W. Bush did during his presidency. So there's no not being out of control about executive orders. Now, are there limits on executive orders? And the answer is yes. In 1952, President Truman nationalized the steel industry because there was a nationwide steel strike, and that was interfering with the Korean War effort and the economic recovery. So Truman nationalized the steel industry. He seized control of all the steel companies and appointed government officials to run them. The steel companies sued, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that executive orders could not be used to create a new legal structure or to deprive anybody of a right. And that's why the presidents don't do that. Now, what about President Obama's executive order about immigration? What he did was that he implemented something called prosecutorial discretion. And that's done widely. It's done by our local sheriff's department all the way up to the FBI. The executive branch has the right to decide how to prosecute the laws, and that's what Obama did. He, in effect, increased a previously authorized program called DACA, the deferred something or other. It has to do with just deciding not to prosecute certain people. That's well within his rights. He also increased the number of Border Patrol officers. That's also well within his rights. Now, those who disagree have options. The Congress could, for example, pass a law to overturn his executive order, which they have the right to do. They'd have to override his veto to do it, which would be much more difficult. A future president could issue an executive order rescinding the executive order that's already been issued. They could sue him, although they're almost certain to lose. But no matter what your opinion of what he did, it was a perfectly legitimate executive order, and it fits right into the pattern of executive orders that presidents have issued for generations.